Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we step into the after-midnight streets of Kansas City, where neon signs hum over quiet boulevards and power moves behind closed doors, far from the public eye. This is the world of Nicholas Civella, a man who preferred influence over attention, where control was exercised quietly and decisions made in back rooms could shape an entire city. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because of danger in the open, but because it demanded patience, secrecy, and absolute loyalty in a world where one mistake could echo for years. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the quiet, calculating story of Nicholas Civella. Tonight, we leave the coastal cities behind, the crowded, shouting streets of New York and Chicago. We travel inland, to a place where the power didn't whisper or shout, but rather hummed. A low, steady frequency felt in the foundations of a wide-open city that believed it was beyond the rules. This is Kansas City, and our story is about the man who learned to conduct that frequency, who became its master for decades, all while convincing the world he was just a simple, quiet man who loved his family. This is the story of Nicholas Civella. To understand Nick Civella, you must first understand the kingdom he was born into. Kansas City in the 1920s wasn't just a Midwestern hub. It was an oasis of vice, a sanctuary for greed, all operating under a single, breathtakingly simple principle. The city hall is for sale. The political machine run by Tom Pendergast didn't just tolerate the mob, it partnered with it. Gambling dens, jazz clubs pouring bootleg liquor, brothels, they all operated with police badges in their pockets and political protection at the highest level. Crime wasn't a shadow industry here, it was the public utility. Into this wide-open city, young Nick Civella arrived as a child with his Sicilian immigrant family. He grew up not in the silence of secrecy, but in the roaring, chaotic symphony of sanctioned sin. He watched as his older brother, Cork Civella, dove headfirst into the action, running numbers, managing clubs, becoming a face in the crowd. Nick was different. He was quiet, observant, with a watchful gaze that missed nothing. While others were drawn to the bright lights and loud music of 12th Street, Nick was drawn to the back rooms where the real math was done. He saw that in a town where everything was for sale, the real power wasn't in owning a club, but in owning the protection for all the clubs. It wasn't in running a dice game, but in controlling the wire service that brought the racing results from tracks around the country. He learned the trade from the ground up, under the tutelage of the reigning king, Charles the Big Guy Corallo. But Nick's apprenticeship wasn't about muscle. It was about logistics, about finance, about relationships. He became a master of the Italian lottery, the policy game, a numbers racket that was a poor man's dream. He understood the psychology. Hope was a product you could sell for a nickel a day. He built his own route, collecting those nickels and dimes from waitresses, factory workers, and housewives, ensuring they got paid when their number hit. His word was his bond. In the chaotic marketplace of crime, he built a reputation for quiet reliability. This was the first layer of his education. In a corrupt world, be the dependable criminal. While other hoods flashed cash and attracted police attention, even in a bought city, there were limits. Nick dressed modestly, lived quietly, and kept his ledgers precise. He was a businessman, and his business was the slow, steady accumulation of other people's dreams. His personal life became his fortress. He married his sweetheart, Rose, and began a family. To his neighbors in the Italian enclave of the North End, he was just Nick, a good son, a devoted husband, a man who might have a lucky streak at the track but who was always polite, always reserved. The violence of his world was something he orchestrated, not something he performed. He was the thinker, the planner, the one who understood that, in the long run, patience and calculation defeated brute force every time. The Pendergast machine eventually fell in the late 1930s, and with it, the era of the wide-open town. The FBI and federal prosecutors began to look at Kansas City with new eyes. For many, this was a disaster. For Nick Civella, it was an opportunity. The loud, clumsy operators who had thrived in the glare of political protection were now exposed, vulnerable. The quiet, careful man who had built a loyal network and kept his affairs orderly was positioned to survive and to rise. He watched as the old guard was indicted, harassed, or retired. He stepped forward, not with a declaration of war, but with a proposition to the other surviving powers. He spoke of consolidation, of efficiency, of running their operations like a legitimate business alliance to withstand the new heat. He was reasonable, he was persuasive, and most importantly, he had the network, the trust of the street, and the cleanest hands. By the end of World War II, a new order had emerged from the ashes of the Pendergast era, and at its center, often letting louder, more charismatic men take the public titles, was the quiet, strategic mind of Nicholas Civella. The kingdom had been shaken, but the man who believed in building his power underground, in the deep, silent roots, was just beginning to grow. The era of the showman was over. The era of the careful, relentless gardener had begun. The fall of the Pendergast machine left Kansas City not with silence, but with a chaotic, scrambling static. The old protection was gone. Police who had once looked away for a monthly envelope now felt pressure to make arrests. Federal eyes, once blissfully shut, were now peering in from the edges of town. For the men who had operated in the open, it was a terrifying time. They were like crabs whose rock had been lifted, scrambling for new cover under the sudden glare of the sun. Nick Civella didn't scramble. He had never relied on the rock. He had always operated in the cool, damp sand beneath it. While others panicked, he saw the new landscape with a surveyor's calm eye. The key, he understood, was not to find a new single protector, but to become the protection. To make the system itself so lean, so efficient, and so quietly intimidating that it no longer needed political crutches. It would stand on its own, a shadow government with its own laws, its own economy, and its own enforcement. He began to consolidate. His first and most crucial alliance was with the DiGiovanni brothers, Charles and William. They were tough, respected, and controlled significant swaths of the North End. But they were soldiers, not generals. Nick offered them a partnership. He brought the strategic mind, the intricate financial web, the patience. They brought muscle, street credibility, and loyalty. It was a perfect, symbiotic merger. Together, they began a quiet campaign of persuasion, absorbing smaller policy operations, negotiating treaties over territory, and presenting a unified, reasonable front to other independent operators. The message was always the same. Join us and prosper in the new, quiet order. Stand alone, and you will be alone against the feds and against us. Nick's masterstroke was his understanding of the wire service. Gambling was the lifeblood of the city's underworld, and the wire, the teletype machine that brought instant race results from tracks across the country, was its beating heart. He didn't just want a piece of the action. He wanted to own the heart itself. Through a series of calculated moves, he gained control over the local wire service operations. This wasn't about owning a betting parlor. It was about owning the information that every betting parlor needed to survive. Any bookmaker who wanted to stay in business had to pay Civella's organization a percentage, a subscription fee, for the life-giving data. Refusal meant your patrons would get yesterday's news, and you'd be broke in a week. It was a clean, brutal, and brilliantly passive form of control. He had learned from the Pendergast era. Tax the activity, don't just run it. During these years of careful empire building, Nick's personal life remained his sanctuary and his masterpiece of camouflage. He and Rose moved to a comfortable, unpretentious home. He was a doting father to his son and daughter. He attended church, supported local charities anonymously, and was known to help neighbors in a pinch. He cultivated the image of a successful, perhaps slightly mysterious businessman. He owned a vending machine company, a piece of a restaurant, other small ventures. They were legitimate fronts, but also a source of genuine pride, a tangible connection to the straight world he manipulated from afar. This duality became his armor. To the FBI agents who began to occasionally take note of him, he was a frustrating subject. He wasn't a flashy nightclub owner. He wasn't seen brawling in public. His arrest record was minor and old. He was a family man who liked to tend his garden and follow the horses. They sensed he was significant, but he gave them nothing to grasp. No dramatic phone calls. He preferred in-person conversations in moving cars or crowded restaurants. No volatile partners, no lavish spending. He was a ghost in a suit, fading into the heartland normalcy of Kansas City. By the early 1950s, the scrambling static had settled into a new low hum. A new order, sleek and efficient, had replaced the garish chaos of the Pendergast era. And at the center of this quiet machine was Nicholas Civella. He wasn't called the boss in headlines. He was simply Nick, the man other powerful men went to see for a quiet talk and an unshakable agreement. He had proven his core thesis. In the wake of a storm, the deepest roots not only survive, they take over the soil. Kansas City was his soil, and as the national spotlight of organized crime fixation began to swing away from New York and toward the interior of the country, those deep, quiet roots were about to be tested by a force far more intrusive than the local police. The gardener was about to face a long, cold winter. Every kingdom, no matter how quiet, exists on a map. And in the America of the 1950s, the shadow map of organized crime had its own capital, its own summits where the powerful gathered not to fight, but to broker peace and divide spoils. This was the Commission. For years, Kansas City had been viewed by the coastal families as a profitable, somewhat distant outpost, a useful partner, but not a seat at the main table. Nick Civella was about to change that, not by demanding a chair, but by demonstrating that the heartland held power that could no longer be ignored. The signal moment came in 1957 with the now infamous Appalachian meeting. Dozens of mob bosses from across the country, from New York to Detroit to Buffalo, traveled to a secluded estate in upstate New York for a conference. The agenda was the future, settling disputes, discussing new ventures, reaffirming alliances. It was the corporate annual meeting of the underworld. Nick Civella was invited. His decision on whether to attend was a window into his soul. The old Nick, the ambitious young consolidator, might have seen it as his moment of arrival, a chance to be seen among the legendary names. But the Nick Civella of 1957 was a different creature. He was the master of a quiet domain. He looked at the gathering with a cold strategist's eye and saw not an opportunity, but a target. Dozens of the most wanted men in America, all gathered in one remote location. It was, to him, an act of astonishing arrogance, a failure of the very caution he lived by. He sent his regrets. He had pressing business in Kansas City. While the exact reason remains part of his mystery, those who knew him understood. Nick Civella did not believe in drawing a circle around himself and every rival he had. He believed in being elsewhere, in being unknown, in being the man whose face wasn't in the group photo. His instinct was proven catastrophically correct. The New York State Police, tipped off by a curious trooper, raided the estate. Bosses in expensive suits fled through the woods, stumbling over fences, hiding in ditches. Over 60 mob luminaries were detained and identified. It was a public relations disaster of epic proportions. Appalachian became front-page news across the nation, proof positive of a vast, national, criminal conspiracy. It sparked congressional hearings, intensified FBI focus, and turned every attendee into a marked man. In Kansas City, Nick Civella read the papers. He saw the mugshots, the frantic headlines, and he allowed himself a rare, private moment of grim satisfaction. His philosophy of silence had been vindicated on the national stage. While the East Coast bosses were being hauled before senators, forced to take the Fifth Amendment under the flashbulbs of the press, Civella was in his back office on Independence Avenue, reviewing the weekly wire service receipts. The heat was on, but it was shining 1,000 miles away. Yet Appalachian also created a vacuum. The old national order was embarrassed, disrupted, and under siege. The Commission needed stability, reliable partners who hadn't been scorched by the spotlight. And who was more reliable than the boss who had foreseen the disaster? Who was more stable than the man who ran a city without fanfare, whose name wasn't in the Appalachian arrest reports? Quietly, through back channels, Nick Civella's stock began to rise. He was no longer just a regional power. He was now seen as a wise elder, a pragmatic leader who understood the new rules of survival. When disputes arose between families over territory in the expanding markets of Las Vegas or the Caribbean, Civella's opinion was sought. His counsel was valued because it was free of bluster and grounded in cold, Midwestern practicality. He became a respected arbitrator, a fixer whose word could be trusted because his power was so self-evidently secure. This period marked his true arrival as a national figure, but in the only way he would ever accept, influence without fame. He never sought the title of boss of bosses. He sought the reality of being the man other bosses called when they needed a problem solved quietly. He had turned his avoidance of a meeting into the ultimate credential. In a world panicked by visibility, the most powerful man was the one you couldn't see. Back home, the lesson of Appalachian only deepened his methods. He became more meticulous, more insulated. He communicated through layers. He invested more heavily in legitimate fronts, not just as covers, but as real businesses to sink his wealth into. The vending machine company expanded. He looked at the burgeoning field of Las Vegas casino skimming, not as a chance for glamour, but as a sophisticated accounting exercise, a way to silently siphon wealth from a glittering source and funnel it back to the quiet heartland. The farmer from Kansas City was now harvesting from fields he had never bothered to visit. The quiet hum of his power had become a frequency heard in boardrooms from New York to Nevada. And as the 1960s dawned, bringing with it a revolution in music, culture, and technology, Nicholas Civella stood poised, a stone-faced anachronism of silence, ready to prove that his old-world methods could bend even the newest, brightest American dreams to his will. The next target was a kingdom of neon, and Nick Civella never believed in flashing lights. Las Vegas in the 1960s was a mirage made real, an electric bloom of neon and ambition rising from the desert floor. To the world, it was a playground. To the East Coast families, it was a giant, slot-lined piggy bank to be cracked open. But to Nicholas Civella, watching from 1,000 miles away in his quiet Kansas City office, Las Vegas was something else entirely. It was a logistical puzzle. The money wasn't in the winning or losing at the tables. It was in the river of cash that flowed through the counting rooms. And a river, if you knew how to quietly divert it, could irrigate an empire back home. The East Coast families, particularly the Chicago outfit and the Milwaukee mob, had already planted their flags in Vegas, using frontmen to secure points in casinos like the Stardust, the Fremont, and the Tropicana. But their operations were often messy, fueled by ego and a desire for the spotlight. They enjoyed the comped suites, the showgirls, the high roller status. Nick Civella had no interest in any of that. He was interested in the skim, the silent, systematic theft of a percentage of the casino's unreported cash profits before it ever hit the books. To solve the Vegas puzzle, Nick needed two things: a trusted man on the ground and a flaw in the machine. For the man, he turned to the one person whose loyalty was bone deep: his older brother, Cork Civella. Where Nick was the cerebral strategist, Cork was the operator, tough, street-smart, gregarious, where Nick was reserved. He could move in Vegas circles, handle the personalities, and enforce the plan without drawing the wrong kind of attention. He was Nick's eyes, ears, and fists in the desert. The flaw in the machine was human nature. Casino managers and slot machine counting room employees weren't paid fortunes. They watched millions flow through their hands every week while they collected a salary. The temptation for the right incentive and the right assurance of protection was immense. Cork, under Nick's meticulous direction, began to cultivate these individuals. The approach was classic Civella, not a violent shakedown, but a business proposition. He offered them a partnership, a small, silent share of the river in exchange for looking the other way as the diversion took place. The offer came with an unspoken but clearly understood guarantee. Compliance meant wealth. Betrayal meant consequences from an organization that reached back to Kansas City and beyond. The system they built was a masterpiece of white-collar crime. Coins from slot machines would be diverted into separate buckets. Cash from table games would be short-counted. The stolen cash would be gathered, packaged discreetly, and then smuggled out of the casino, often by trusted couriers posing as entertainers or vacationing businessmen. The money would then be funneled through a complex series of transfers and legitimate business investments before finding its way back to the Civella organization's coffers in the Midwest. Nick himself rarely set foot in Las Vegas. When he did, it was never for pleasure. He'd meet with his brother and their contacts in anonymous hotel rooms or at the airport, reviewing the numbers, stressing security, and preaching caution. He was repulsed by the garishness of the Strip. To him, the true value of Vegas was its utter predictability. It was a factory that printed money. His job was to own a piece of the assembly line, not to enjoy the finished product. This quiet, efficient operation soon made the Civella Group one of the most successful skimming enterprises in Vegas. And success in the shadow world always attracts notice. The flashier East Coast families, whose own skim was sometimes erratic due to internal squabbles and flashy behavior, took note of the steady, reliable stream of cash coming out of the Civella-controlled points. They began to treat Nick with a new level of respect, bordering on wariness. He was the master of a dull, lucrative science they struggled to perfect. But the very nature of the skim meant weaving a web inside the casino corporations themselves. And corporations have other predators. Federal investigators with forensic accountants and a mounting suspicion that the mob's takeover of Las Vegas was more than just rumor. The FBI had begun Project Skim, a dedicated operation to follow the cash. Nick Civella, back in Kansas City, felt the change in the air. He read the business pages, noting increased regulatory scrutiny on casinos. He instructed Cork to tighten procedures, to slow the flow if necessary. The puzzle was getting more complicated. The river was being watched. He knew that in the desert, the quietest creatures often survived not by outrunning the storm, but by burrowing deeper, waiting for the heat to pass. The Neon Kingdom was proving to be the greatest test yet of his lifelong principle, that the deepest roots could draw sustenance from even the most hostile soil. But the sand was shifting, and a long, cold shadow was beginning to stretch across the desert from Washington, D.C. Every empire, no matter how carefully constructed, has a weak point. For the kingdom of silence Nicholas Civella built, that point was not a rival or a soldier, but something far more mundane and insidious. A piece of paper with a federal seal. The 1970s dawned not with a bang, but with the slow, grinding turn of the American legal machine, armed with new tools and a cold, patient fury. The era of quiet corruption was about to meet the era of the wiretap and the RICO statute. The first real chill wind blew in from the desert. The FBI's Project Skim was bearing fruit. Agents, using surveillance and financial forensics, were slowly piecing together the intricate plumbing of the casino skim. The river of cash that flowed from Las Vegas to Kansas City was being mapped, drop by drop. Indictments were being prepared, not against street-level bookies, but against the accountants, the couriers, the middle managers, the quiet cogs in Civella's machine. Nick sensed the pressure changing. The anonymous hotel room meetings became rarer, more fraught. Communication with his brother Cork in Vegas shifted to painful, old-fashioned methods. Face-to-face meetings in neutral cities. Messages passed through a chain of trusted associates. The electronic age was becoming his enemy. He knew the government could listen, so he chose to speak less and less. Then, in 1978, the blow fell. A federal grand jury handed down a sweeping indictment. Nicholas Civella, his brother Cork, and several top lieutenants were charged under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations RICO Act. The charges were a blueprint of his life's work. Conspiracy, illegal gambling, wire fraud, and most critically, overseeing the Las Vegas skim. The prosecutors didn't just allege a crime. They alleged a criminal enterprise, and they named Nick as its CEO. For a man who had spent a lifetime avoiding the spotlight, the glare was now unbearable. He was arrested, fingerprinted, and paraded before cameras. The quiet businessman from the North End was now alleged mob boss Nicholas Civella on the evening news. The trial was a spectacle he detested. His lawyers fought fiercely, arguing that the government's case was built on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of unreliable informants. But the tide had turned. The public mood demanded scalps, and the forensic paper trail was damning. The verdict was guilty. Nicholas Civella, the ghost of Kansas City, was sentenced to a substantial term in federal prison. At his sentencing, he stood before the judge, not as a defiant gangster, but as a grim, elderly man. He said little, maintaining his dignity but offering no confession, no melodrama. He was a captain going down with his ship, silent to the last. Prison was a unique kind of hell for a man like Civella, not because of the violence or the deprivation, but because of the noise and the loss of control. He was surrounded by the chaotic, loud failure of other criminals' plans. He was subject to schedules, counts, and the arbitrary rules of guards. His meticulous mind, used to orchestrating complex operations across states, was now confined to the calculus of a prison yard. Yet, even behind bars, his influence did not vanish. It mutated. He became an elder statesman in exile. Messages still found their way in and out. Disputes within the family or with allies were still referred to him for a final, quiet word. His son, Anthony, and his brother Cork, who was also convicted, worked to keep the operations running, but everyone knew the true authority still rested with the old man in his prison cell, reading letters and sending back terse, carefully worded replies. His health, never robust, began a slow decline under the stress of confinement. The tightness that had been in his chest for years grew more persistent. He was diagnosed with a heart condition. The empire he built was under siege from without, and now its architect was fading from within. The deep roots were still there, but the tree at the center was weathering a brutal storm, its leaves turning brittle. The next chapter would not be about expansion, but about survival. A desperate, silent fight to hold the kingdom together from a prison cell, as the walls, both literal and legal, closed in on the life's work of Nicholas Civella. The prison was not a cage for an animal. It was a sensory deprivation tank for a master strategist. The world Nicholas Civella had commanded was one of subtle signals, of quiet conversations in moving cars, of ledgers that told a hidden story. Here, at the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, ironically just a drive from his Kansas City kingdom, the signals were loud, crude, and meaningless. The clang of steel doors, the blare of the PA system, the shouted arguments in the yard. It was a world devoid of the nuance he lived by. He adapted, as he always had, by redefining the battlefield. His prison cell became a boardroom in exile. The outside world, with its problems and disputes, did not stop because he was behind walls. If anything, his incarceration created vacuums of power, sparked ambitions among younger men, and raised questions about the future. Messages reached him, not through wires that could be tapped, but through the oldest, most secure network. Face-to-face whispers during visiting hours, or coded phrases in letters about family and health. A nephew's lingering cough might mean a lingering problem with a union official. A comment about the poor garden soil back home could reference shaky financial ground. His brother Cork was in a different facility, but their communication, though strained and slow, maintained the partnership. They made decisions, settled disputes, and directed strategy through this fractured, painstaking network. Nick's word remained law, but the distance and delay created a dangerous friction. He could no longer sense the mood of a room, read a face for lies, or act with immediacy. He was governing by delayed telegram in an age of instant threats. The most profound change was within himself. The silence he had cultivated as a weapon now became his prison within a prison. The quiet confidence that had intimidated rivals now looked like solitary resignation to the guards and other inmates. He had no interest in the petty hustles of the prison yard, the cigarette economy, the gambling on sports. His hustle had spanned states. He spent his hours reading newspapers with an analytical eye, not for the sports scores, but for business section stories about casino regulation, union elections, or shifts in federal law enforcement priorities. He was doing market research from a cell. His physical decline, a slow leak he had managed for years, became a torrent under the stress of confinement. The heart condition worsened. The prison clinic was adequate for stitches and aspirin, but not for the careful, sustained management a frail, aging man required. He began to look his age and then some. The sharp, watchful gaze remained, but it was set in a face that grew more gaunt, the skin papery. The suit, now replaced by a standard-issue khaki uniform, hung on a frame that was shrinking. Yet, even in this diminished state, his reputation forged a unique space around him. He was not feared by the general population in the way a violent predator might be. He was respected with a distance that bordered on awe. Younger mobsters from other families, doing their own bits, would sometimes seek him out in the library or the yard, not for favor, but for counsel. They wanted to hear the perspective of the man who had avoided the Appalachian trap, who had built a machine so quiet it took the feds decades to hear its hum. He spoke sparingly, often in parables, about patience and the perils of attention. To these men, he was a living legend, a ghost made briefly visible. But the outside world was moving on. The convictions of the Civella brothers had emboldened law enforcement. The Kansas City mob's operations were being dismantled piece by piece in a series of smaller, follow-up trials. The wire service was dismantled by technology and competition. The political protection that had once been so effortless was now non-existent in a new, reform-minded city. The empire was in a state of managed decline, directed by a fading king from a rented room. In the darkest hours of the night, with the prison in a rare, uneasy quiet, Nicholas Civella would lie on his bunk, the faint glow of a security light casting bars across the ceiling. The hum of his kingdom was now just a faint echo in his memory, replaced by the real, relentless hum of fluorescent lights and distant generators. He had outlasted Pendergast, outsmarted Appalachian, and harvested the desert. He had built a legacy on the principle that the deepest power is the unseen power. Now he was finally truly unseen, buried alive in the system he had spent a lifetime cleverly avoiding. The roots were still there, but the tree was now inside a concrete box, its leaves rustling with the faint, dry sound of history turning a page. The fight was no longer for expansion or even for control. It was a grim, daily fight for relevance in a world that was learning to forget the need for a quiet man like him. Time in prison is not a river but a stagnant pond, each day a ripple that looks exactly like the last. For Nicholas Civella, the routine became a meditation. The wake-up call, the count, the walk to the mess hall, the hours in the library, the walk in the yard under a boundless sky that felt like a taunt. He moved through it with a detached precision, a ghost going through the motions of being alive. His body was in Leavenworth, but his mind was a silent satellite, orbiting the world he had built, monitoring its slow decay and plotting its preservation. The messages from the outside grew less frequent, and their content shifted. It was less about expansion, less about new ventures. It was about containment, a soldier being leaned on by the IRS, a front business being audited, a loyal union contact facing a tough re-election against a reform candidate. Nick's replies, funneled through his few trusted visitors, were simple directives. Asterisk, pay the tax bill. Cooperate with the audit. Support the opponent quietly. Asterisk, the vision was no longer grand. It was surgical, defensive, a series of small, crucial holds against the tide. He received news of the outside world through a careful filter of newspapers and the hushed reports of visitors. He saw the rise of a new, more aggressive FBI approach. He read about the convictions of men he knew from other cities, men who had made the mistakes he hadn't. Taped conversations, flashy lifestyles, loose talk. Each headline was a confirmation of his life's philosophy. Each mugshot was a lesson he had learned decades before. But the most painful communication was about his own city. Kansas City was changing. The old North End neighborhoods were being diluted. The political machine was a relic discussed in history books. A new generation saw the mob not as a dark fixture of power, but as a curious, fading artifact. The respectful fear that had been the bedrock of his influence was eroding, replaced by either indifference or the boldness of those who thought the old man was finished. This erosion presented a new kind of problem, one that couldn't be solved with a directive. It was a problem of perception. To maintain the structure, the people within it, the collectors, the drivers, the union stewards, had to believe the center still held. They had to believe that Nick Civella, even from prison, was a force to be reckoned with. If that belief faded, the whole careful architecture would crumble from apathy, not from assault. So, Nick orchestrated a campaign of managed visibility. He instructed his son, Anthony, and his remaining captains on the outside to handle certain matters with a little more assertion. A problem at a betting operation wasn't just solved quietly. It was solved in a way that sent a clear, if unspoken, message. A delinquent debtor would find his car on blocks, not as a threat, but as a demonstration that the machinery of enforcement, though older and slower, was still operational. It was theater, staged for an audience that needed to remember its lines. Inside, he played his own part. In the prison yard, he was no longer just the quiet old man. He became a monument. He would sit on a specific bench at a specific time. Men would approach not to chat, but to pay respects. A brief nod, a murmured "Nick," before moving on. He allowed stories to circulate, stories about the old days, about Appalachian, about Vegas. He never confirmed them, never denied them. His silence became a canvas on which others painted a legend of undiminished power. This performance was exhausting. It required energy his frail body could scarcely muster. The heart condition, the prison food, the lack of proper care were draining the vessel dry. Yet the mind, the will remained ferociously alive. He was fighting the last war, the war for legacy, for the idea that the system he built would outlast the bricks and mortar of his prison and the failing muscle of his heart. One afternoon, during a visit from his lawyer, a meeting about a pending appeal that both men knew was hopeless, the lawyer mentioned, almost in passing, a new federal task force that had been formed. Its mandate was to target not just active crime, but to seize the accumulated assets of organized crime figures, to take the profit out of the business. Nick listened, his expression unchanging. When the lawyer finished, Nick was quiet for a long moment, looking past him at the sterile visiting room wall. Finally, he spoke, his voice a dry rustle. "They always think it's about the money, sir. The profit," Nick clarified, his eyes coming back to focus with a glacial sharpness. "They think if they take the money, they end the business. They don't understand. The business wasn't the money. The business was the agreement, the understanding of how things work. You can't seize an understanding. You can't indict a silence." He leaned forward slightly, the most animation he'd shown in months. "They got the king. They'll get the castle. But the country is in people's minds. And that," he said, sitting back with a finality that seemed to drain him utterly, "that they can never touch." The visit ended. As he was led back to his cell, the guard's hand on his elbow, Nicholas Civella wore the ghost of a smile. They had his body. They were chasing his money. But the real thing he had built, the quiet, ruthless agreement that had ruled a city for decades, existed now only in memory and fear. And as long as one person remembered, or one person was afraid, the ghost of his kingdom would walk. The fight was no longer for power, but for the persistence of a shadow. And shadows are very, very hard to kill. The body is a clock, and every cell knows its time. In the sterile, unforgiving environment of the federal prison, the clock within Nicholas Civella ticked louder, its rhythm growing erratic. The chronic heart condition, long managed with the careful control he applied to all things, spiraled beyond his command. Prison doctors prescribed pills that made him drowsy. The bland, salty food exacerbated his blood pressure. The constant, low-grade stress of confinement was a vice around his chest, tightening each year. Yet, his will remained a separate entity, a sharp, cold shard of ice floating in the failing vessel. He continued his rituals, the walks in the yard, slower now, with a pause halfway to catch his breath that looked to observers like a man simply, stopping to contemplate the sky, the hours in the prison library, where he now read history books, tracing the rise and fall of empires, of cities, of men who thought their power would last 1,000 years. He saw the same patterns, the same fatal flaws of pride and visibility. The outside world continued its slow, inevitable metamorphosis. The convictions had crippled the operational arm of his empire. The Kansas City crime family, a term he would have never used but now saw in newspaper clippings, was described as decimated, a shell, a fading power. His son Anthony and his remaining loyalists held on to pieces, A dwindling numbers operation, a few bars, some lingering influence in a local union or two. But the golden pipeline from Vegas was a memory. The wire service was obsolete. The city had new masters now. Developers, corporations, a new generation of politicians whose palms were greased with campaign donations, not cash-filled envelopes. Visits from family became the fragile tether to his humanity. His wife Rose, aged and weary but steadfast, would sit across from him, her eyes speaking volumes her lips would not utter. She talked of grandchildren, of a new roof on the house, of the neighbor's dog. Normal things, sacred things. In these moments, the monument of Nick Civella would soften at the edges. The guard who was not a king, just a husband, a grandfather, a man who had chosen a path that led here, to this plastic chair and this plexiglass divider. It was during one of these visits, in the winter of his final year, that a different kind of message was relayed, not about business but about history. A writer, a journalist from back east, was working on a book. Not a sensational true crime potboiler, but a serious, investigative history of organized crime in America. And he wanted to understand Kansas City. He had been interviewing everyone from retired cops to old-time bartenders. The word was he was trying to get to the heart of the Civella era. He was asking questions about philosophy, about structure, about why it all worked for so long. Nick listened as this was told to him, not by a lawyer, but by a trusted nephew. He didn't respond at first. He looked at Rose, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. A warning, a plea for silence. He turned back to the nephew. "What does he want from me?" Nick asked, his voice thin but clear. "An interview. He says he wants your perspective. For the historical record." A faint, dry sound escaped Nick's lips. Not a laugh, but the ghost of one. "The historical record," he repeated. "They write the history. We live it. Then they write it wrong." He fell silent, weighing the ultimate temptation. To explain himself, to set the record straight, to have his name in a book not as a caricature, but as a strategist. It was the last thing the world could offer him, a version of legitimacy. He thought of the Appalachian bosses, forever frozen in that humiliating police photo. He thought of the flashy New York dons who gave grand, defiant interviews and were then imprisoned by their own words on FBI tapes. He thought of his own lifetime of silence, the fortress it had built. He looked at his wife, then at the gray light on the visiting room wall. He had built a kingdom on things unsaid. To speak now would be to tear down the last, most important wall himself. "Tell him no," Nick said, the decision settling into his bones like a final, comfortable weight. "Tell him the story is in what didn't happen, in the meetings that didn't take place, in the words that were never said. If he's any good, he'll figure that out. If he's not, it doesn't matter." The message was sent. The writer was refused. And in that refusal, Nicholas Civella made his final, definitive move. He chose to let the mystery stand. He chose the power of the unanswered question over the vanity of explanation. He would remain a silhouette, a man defined by the empty space around him. After that, a profound calm seemed to settle over him. The business of survival became less urgent. The walk in the yard became slower, more of a shuffle. He still read, but his eyes would close for longer periods, the book open on his lap, as if he were dreaming of the words rather than reading them. He was conserving his energy, not for another fight, but for the final act of stillness. The clock was winding down. The ghost was preparing to depart the machine that had housed it for so long, leaving behind only the echo of its silence. A silence he had spent a lifetime crafting into the most formidable weapon of all. The story was nearly complete, and he was determined that its last and most powerful word would be a whisper that faded into nothing. The end, when it came, was not a dramatic flourish. It was a slow dimming, a quiet concession. The prison infirmary was a world of sanitized beige and the low, constant sigh of medical machinery. Here, Nicholas Civella was stripped of his last remaining identity, the inmate, the yard monument. He was simply a patient, a failing heart on a monitor, a number on a chart. The guard still stood outside the door, but their presence felt less like a threat and more like a formality, a ritual for a king whose kingdom had already dissolved into memory. His family was allowed more frequent visits now, a small mercy in the face of the inevitable. They would gather around the bed, Rose, his children, a few close relatives. The conversations were hushed, not out of fear of eavesdropping, but out of a reverence for the quiet that was finally, truly claiming him. They spoke of old times, good times, simple times before the world knew the name Civella as anything but their own. In these moments, his mind would sometimes drift, clear but distant. He'd mention a corner grocery from his childhood, the smell of a specific bakery, the name of a horse he'd bet on and won 50 years prior. The monumental strategy of his life had burned away, leaving the glowing embers of personal recollection. He was, in the end, remembering the man he was before he chose to become the power. The news from the outside still trickled in, a dull echo of a once vibrant world. He learned of the death of an old associate from natural causes. He heard that a former nightclub he'd once had an interest in was being torn down to make way for a parking garage. Each piece of news was like a stone dropping into the pond of his past, the ripples growing fainter and fainter. He had one final official visitor, not a lawyer, but a representative from the U.S. Parole Commission. Given his age and deteriorating health, there was a slim bureaucratic chance for a compassionate release, to die at home, not in a federal bed. The man was polite, clipboard in hand, going through a checklist of criteria. Nick listened to the questions. Did he pose a threat to the community? Had he demonstrated rehabilitation? Was his continued incarceration necessary for the deterrence of others? When it was his turn to speak, he didn't appeal for mercy. He didn't rage at the system. He looked at the parole officer with those still keen eyes and said, quietly, "Where would I go?" The question hung in the sterile air. He wasn't asking for a physical address. He was stating a profound truth. The Kansas City he ruled was gone. The life he built was in ruins. The world outside was no longer his. His prison cell had become the only territory he had left. The request for release was, unsurprisingly, denied. The system, which he had outmaneuvered for a lifetime, would have its final, literal hold on him. He accepted the news with a slow nod. It was the last negotiation of his life, and he had not bothered to fight it. In his final days, the pain was managed, and the fog of medication grew thicker. But in the lucid intervals, he exhibited a profound, unsettling peace. The struggle was over. The calculations had all been run. The balance sheet of his life, the immense power weighed against the ultimate cost, was complete, and only he could see the final total. On a cold March morning in 1983, with a light snow dusting the high, narrow windows of the prison infirmary, Nicholas Civella's heart, that tired engine that had driven a hidden empire for 77 years, simply stopped. There was no drama, no last words. The monitor emitted a flat, sustained tone. The guards noted the time. The doctor was summoned. The procedures were followed. The news was relayed to the outside world in a brief wire service bulletin. Former organized crime figure Nicholas Civella died today in federal prison. The stories that followed were summaries of his indictment, his conviction, his ties to Las Vegas. They spoke of his alleged power, his reputed control. The language of journalism, constrained by libel laws and the lack of a living man to sue, danced around the truth he had lived. But in Kansas City, in the quiet neighborhoods and the closed social clubs, in the memories of old cops and retired reporters, the news landed differently. It wasn't just an obituary. It was the period at the end of a very long, very dark sentence. An era definitively was over. The last of the old world chiefs, the man who had inherited the wide-open town and refined its corruption into a silent science, was gone. His body was released to his family. The funeral at a small Catholic church in the North End was private, subdued. The flowers were plentiful, but the mourners were few and genuine. There were no legions of dark-suited gangsters, no procession of limousines. The spectacle he had always avoided followed him faithfully in death. As the casket was lowered into the Kansas soil, a cold wind blew across the cemetery, scattering the last of the winter's dry leaves. The roots of his influence, once so deep and widespread, were finally severed. The ghost of Nicholas Civella had at last departed, leaving behind a city that was already forgetting the taste of his particular kind of silence, and a history that would forever struggle to define the shadow of a man who believed the greatest power lay in never casting one. The grave in the Kansas City cemetery was a period in the story, but it was not the end of the sentence. For an empire built on whispers and shadow, death is not an erasure. It is a transfer of energy. The physical presence of Nicholas Civella was gone, but the currents he had set in motion, the fears he had seeded, and the vacuums he left behind began to swirl with new activity. The silence he cultivated did not descend with him into the earth. It was up for grabs. In the weeks following the funeral, the city's underworld, what was left of it, existed in a state of suspended animation. It was a kingdom without a king, but with all the old maps still in place. His son, Anthony Tony Civella, was the heir apparent, but inheritance in this world is not a matter of paperwork. It is a matter of consensus, of perceived strength, and of the quiet, often deadly assessment of other power players. Tony was respected as Nick's son, but he was not Nick. He lacked the lifetime of accrued, unspoken authority. He was a steward, not a founder. The old guard who had survived the federal onslaught, men in their 60s and 70s who had operated under Civella's precise, low-profile model, looked to Tony with a mixture of loyalty and deep anxiety. They wondered if the subtle, patient approach could survive in a new America that was increasingly wired, watched, and indifferent to the old neighborhood codes. Younger, hungrier faces, some from within the family, some from rival factions emboldened by Nick's passing, watched from the edges. They saw not a legacy to uphold, but a throne to be claimed. The first test was not a violent confrontation, but a financial audit from beyond the grave. The federal government, utilizing the powerful RICO statutes, initiated proceedings to seize assets they could conclusively link to Nick Civella's criminal enterprise. This was a new front in the war, posthumous confiscation. Lawyers descended upon the family, not to defend a man, but to pick apart the financial architecture he had built over a lifetime. The vending machine company, the pieces of real estate, the bank accounts, all were scrutinized. The fight was no longer to keep Nick out of prison, but to keep his family from being stripped bare by the government he had evaded for so long. Rose Civella, the widow who had lived a life of quiet strength beside a shadow, now found herself at the center of this storm. Polite, steely, and grieving, she was served with notices, sat through depositions, and defended the legitimacy of her home, her savings, the college funds for her grandchildren. It was a brutal, bureaucratic invasion, a final humiliation orchestrated by the state. In her, the government met not a mob wife, but a formidable matriarch protecting her nest. The battle moved from the streets to the courtroom, a realm Nick had always considered more dangerous than any back alley. Meanwhile, in the prisons where the remnants of the organization were serving their sentences, the news of Nick's death was met with a complex silence. For men like his brother Cork, it was a profound, personal loss coupled with a strategic catastrophe. The North Star was gone. The final arbiter was no longer a phone call or a visit away. Plans for appeals, for maintaining control from inside, were thrown into disarray. The discipline that Nick had enforced began to erode. Inmates loosely affiliated with the family started speaking more freely, testing boundaries, seeking new alliances. The fear of his disapproval, which had traveled through walls, dissipated. And in Las Vegas, the desert city he had viewed as a crude but productive pump, the reaction was a simple, cold calculation. The skim from the casinos had been dead for years, killed by FBI investigations and corporate takeovers. But Nick's name had still carried a certain weight, a historical marker that commanded a baseline of respect from older figures in other families. With his passing, that last bit of leverage vanished. Kansas City was now just another Midwestern city in the mob's geography, its credit rating downgraded. The hidden bank of respect was closed. Yet, in the very heart of the city Nick had dominated, a curious thing began to happen. As the legal battles raged and the underworld adjusted, the legend of the quiet man began to solidify. In the absence of his living, complicated presence, the stories simplified and grew. He became more myth than man. Tales of his foresight at Appalachian, his invisible control of the garment district in its heyday, his ability to rule without raising his voice, were told in hushed tones in certain bars, barbershops, and union halls. The frustrating, elusive figure who gave the FBI so little became, in memory, a genius of criminal restraint. The reality of his slow defeat was overshadowed by the enduring mystery of his long reign. This legend was the final, intangible asset he left behind. It was a legacy of a different kind, not of wealth or territory, but of a methodology. A case study in how to build and hold power in the shadows. For some watching, it was a blueprint. For others, a cautionary tale. But for the city of Kansas City, it was the closing of a dark, defining chapter. The ghost was gone, but the echo of his silence still resonated in the foundations of the old buildings, in the memories of old deals, and in the unsettling quiet of a power structure waiting to see what, or who, would fill the space he left behind. The next moves would not be his, but they would all be reactions to the vacuum created by his departure. The game was still on. Only the most masterful player had finally left the table. A legacy is a weight. For Anthony Tony Civella, stepping into the space his father had occupied was not like putting on a tailored suit. It was like trying to wear a statue. The form was there, imposing and familiar, but it was cold, immovable, and meant for a different man. His first year as the acknowledged head of what remained was a study in the burden of a ghost. Every decision was measured against an unspoken question. What would Nick have done? The old business models were failing. The policy racket, the lifeblood of the North End for half a century, was being killed by state lotteries. Why would a factory worker bet a nickel on a clandestine numbers bank when he could buy a scratch-off ticket at the gas station with the chance to win $1 million? Legally? The legalization of gambling was the ultimate corporate hostile takeover, and it left street operations like Tony's looking obsolete. The wire service was a relic. The quiet, neighborhood-based vice was being supplanted by the bright, noisy, and state-sanctioned kind. Tony faced a brutal choice: adapt or preside over a museum. But adapting in his world was perilous. It meant venturing into new territories, not geographic but operational. Some of the younger, more aggressive voices in his ear whispered about drugs. The cocaine trade of the 1980s was a hurricane of cash, a force so powerful it made the old skim from Vegas look like a gentle rain. It was everywhere, from the glittering clubs to the crumbling projects. The profit margins were astronomical. He heard the arguments. His father's empire was built on vices people considered harmless. A bet on a number, a wager on a horse. It was a tax on hope. Drugs were different. They brought a hotter, more aggressive kind of heat from law enforcement. They attracted violent, unpredictable independent operators. They corrupted from within in a more destructive way. Nick's entire philosophy was about stability, about reducing chaos to a manageable, profitable hum. The drug trade was chaos incarnate. Tony wrestled with the ghost. He could almost hear his father's voice, not in words, but in a principle. Control the environment, don't become part of its fever. To dive into narcotics was to surrender to the fever. Yet, to stand still was to watch the family's income, and thus its influence, its ability to pay lawyers, to support soldiers, to maintain any semblance of structure, dry up and blow away like dust. He made a cautious, compromised move. He would not run drug operations, but he would, for a significant percentage, offer logistical support and protection to a select, proven crew moving marijuana and later powder cocaine. He would be the landlord, not the tenant, the banker, not the dealer. It was an attempt to apply the old ghost tax to the new economy. His organization would provide safe houses, legitimate transportation fronts, and, most importantly, a layer of insulation from street-level violence and competition. In return, they took a cut of the proceeds, laundered through their remaining legitimate fronts. It was a strategic hybrid, but it was a fundamental break from Nick's doctrine. Nick had sought to be invisible within the legitimate economy. Tony was now making the legitimate economy a car wash for illegitimate new money. The risk of exposure multiplied exponentially. Meanwhile, the federal government's posthumous campaign against the Civella assets was a grinding, draining war of attrition. Rose and the family lawyers fought valiantly, but piece by piece, the visible remnants of Nick's life were picked apart. The parking lot he owned was seized. Bank accounts were frozen. The legal fees alone were crippling. This financial pressure from one side made the potential profits from the new drug-adjacent ventures on the other side even more seductive, creating a vicious cycle. Through all this, the legend of Nicholas Civella continued to grow in the underworld's collective memory, becoming purer and more idealized with time. He was now the last real boss, a symbol of an era when power was about patience and intelligence, not flash and firepower. This legend became an ironic shackle for Tony. He was criticized not just for his decisions, but for his very being, for not being the legend. His cautious foray into narcotic support was seen by some old-timers not as a necessary adaptation, but as a betrayal of a sacred code. Tony Civella stood at a crossroads, pulled in three directions: by the grim practicalities of survival in a new era, by the spectral, disapproving presence of his father's legacy, and by the relentless, hungry gaze of a federal system that had defeated the original and was now tightening a new net around the sun. The kingdom of silence had become a noisy, fractured place, and its new, reluctant king was learning that sometimes the most difficult ghost to escape is the one that shares your last name. The strategies of the past were a map to a country that no longer existed, and Tony was now lost in the wilderness between his father's faded world and a future he was struggling, desperately, to define. The problem with dancing with a hurricane is that you can only avoid the eye for so long. Tony Civella's compromise, acting as the silent partner, the insulated banker for the drug trade, was a theory that crumpled upon contact with reality. The quiet, logistical support he promised required dealing with people for whom silence was a foreign language. The crew he'd chosen, while effective, operated on a frequency of paranoia and impulse that was anathema to everything his father had built. Nick's world had been one of muted tones and long-term calculations. This new world was a scream, followed by a desperate, short-term scramble. The first crack wasn't a bust or a betrayal, but a breach of protocol. A member of the crew, high on his own supply and flash with new money, got into a loud public argument at a downtown nightclub. He wasn't arguing about a debt or a territory. It was over a woman. But in his boasting, in his need to assert dominance, he name-dropped. He invoked the Civella name as his backing, a charm he thought would instill fear. Instead, it shone a bright, clumsy spotlight. The incident report written by the responding police officers noted the name. That report found its way from the local precinct to a federal task force that had never stopped looking at the Civella family. For decades, Nick had maintained a firewall between street-level disorder and the serene, untouchable core of his operations. Tony's new model had punctured that firewall. The disorder had a direct line back to him. The principle of insulation was broken. Then came the technological tide. Nick had feared the wiretap, the hidden microphone. But the 1980s brought a new arsenal. Pen registers that logged every number called from a phone, surveillance cameras with telephoto lenses, tracking beacons placed on vehicles. The FBI didn't need to hear Tony discuss a drug deal. They could map the entire network by his movements and associations. They could prove he met repeatedly with known traffickers. They could show money flowing from their accounts into his fronts. The evidence was no longer a conversation. It was a digital pattern, a constellation of guilt that was impossible to explain away. Tony, trying to manage this, found himself doing something his father never had to do: micromanage chaos. Nick had managed a system. Tony was trying to manage people, and volatile people at that. He spent his time putting out fires, soothing bruised egos, settling disputes over percentages, dealing with a courier who had gotten greedy and skimmed a package. This was not strategy. It was crisis management. It drained him, pulled him down into the gritty details he was supposed to be insulated from, and left no time for the long, calm planning that had been his birthright. The most profound failure, however, was in the realm of loyalty. Nick's men were loyal out of a complex brew of respect, fear, and the understanding that the system provided for them and their families indefinitely. Tony's new associates were loyal only to the money, and only until a better offer came along. The concept of La Famiglia meant nothing to them. They were mercenaries, and mercenaries, when pressure mounted, looked for exits. The pressure was mounting in the form of a young, ambitious assistant U.S. attorney who saw the Tony Civella case as a career maker. He wasn't interested in the historical legend of the father. He wanted the actionable conviction of the son. He began presenting evidence to a new grand jury. Subpoenas flew out. Members of the drug crew were picked up on minor charges and offered stark choices. Back in the old neighborhood, the old-timers watched Tony's frantic dance with a deepening sense of grief. They saw not a leader adapting, but a legacy unraveling. The quiet strength was gone, replaced by a visible, sweating strain. The respect that had been a passive, ambient force in Nick's time was now a currency Tony had to desperately spend just to keep order. He was depleting his capital with every crisis. One evening, sitting in what was once his father's office, a room that now felt less like a command center and more like a trap, Tony looked at a faded photo on the wall. It was of his father, much younger, standing anonymously in a crowd at a city function. He was just another face, unseen and powerful. Tony felt the weight of every eye in the city now on him, from the FBI to the street corner. He realized the terrible truth. His father's silence hadn't just been a tactic. It had been the foundation. By venturing into the noisy, chaotic drug trade, even from a distance, Tony had sawed through that foundation. He wasn't just failing to fill his father's shoes. He was standing on ground his father would have never set foot on, and it was crumbling beneath him. The hurricane wasn't coming. He had willingly walked into it, and now he was being pulled apart piece by piece in its roaring, indifferent wind. The final lesson of Nicholas Civella was not about how to hold power, but about the specific, fragile conditions required to hold it quietly. And those conditions, Tony now understood with a sinking finality, were gone forever. The courtroom was a theater of harsh, fluorescent light and polished wood, a world away from the dim, smoke-hazed back rooms where his father had conducted his business. Anthony Civella sat at the defense table, his suit feeling like a costume. This was the ultimate spectacle, the very thing Nicholas Civella had spent a lifetime avoiding. And now, Tony was the star performer in a production he never wanted any part of. The trial was not about a single crime, but about a pattern of conspiracy. The assistant U.S. attorney, a clean-cut man with a relentless, methodical voice, laid out the government's case like an accountant presenting a damning audit. He showed charts, literal charts on easels, mapping phone calls between Tony and the drug crew. He presented financial records, tracing a river of cash from street-level sales into the bank accounts of the Civella family's vending machine company and a small, struggling trucking firm. He called cooperating witnesses, members of the crew who had cut deals, their testimony a staccato rhythm of dates, amounts, and names, all pointing back to the quiet man at the defense table. Tony's lawyers fought hard. They attacked the credibility of the witnesses, calling them liars and desperate men saving their own skin. They argued the financial links were coincidental, the meetings innocent. But the narrative was too clean, the digital paper trail too precise. The story of insulation Tony had tried to build was dismantled, exhibit by exhibit, into a story of direct involvement. Throughout it all, Tony would sometimes catch a glimpse of his mother, Rose, in the front row of the spectators' gallery. Her face was a mask of dignified anguish. He knew what she was seeing. Not just her son on trial, but the final public dismantling of the life she had shared with Nick. The privacy she had cherished was being violated, piece by piece, in open court. Her presence was a silent accusation of its own. As the days dragged on, a strange clarity settled over Tony. The legal technicalities, the objections, the strategies, they began to blur into a background hum. What emerged in stark relief was the profound divergence between his father's path and his own. He saw, with painful acuity, the choices that had led him here. Nick had believed in boundaries, between the street and the office, between noise and silence, between being a criminal and playing one on a public stage. Tony, in his attempt to adapt, had erased those boundaries. He had allowed the street's chaos to infect the office's order. He had traded silence for a desperate, noisy hustle. And now he was playing the only role left for him, the defendant. The most devastating moment didn't come from a witness or a piece of evidence. It came during a recess. One of the old-timers, a retired bookmaker who had been loyal to Nick for 40 years, managed to get a moment with Tony in the hallway. The old man didn't talk about the trial. He took Tony's hand, his own grip still surprisingly strong, and looked him in the eye. He didn't say good luck or stay strong. He said, in a low, gravelly voice thick with emotion, "Your father, he never sat where you're sitting." It wasn't a criticism. It was a eulogy, a stark, simple statement of fact that measured the distance between the legacy and its heir. Nick's genius wasn't just in evading conviction. It was in evading the very stage upon which conviction was performed. Tony had lost long before the jury was sworn in. He had lost the moment he stepped onto the stage. The verdict, when it came, was a foregone conclusion. Guilty on all major counts. As the word rang out in the packed courtroom, Tony felt a peculiar emptiness. The fear, the anxiety, the frantic energy of the fight. It all drained away, leaving behind a cold, hollow certainty. He looked over at the prosecution table. The young attorney allowed himself a small, tight smile of victory. He had bagged his trophy. He had defined Anthony Civella for the history books, not as a strategic heir, but as a convicted racketeer. As the marshals led him away, Tony took one last look at the courtroom. He saw the reporters scribbling, the sketch artists finishing their renditions of his grim face. He had become a public record, a case file, a mugshot. His father had remained a rumor, a shadow, a frustrating blank space in the files of the FBI. In the end, Nick's silence had been his final, unassailable victory. Tony's words, his actions, his very presence in this courtroom were his ultimate defeat. The sentence would come later. The appeals would be filed. But in that moment, walking out of the light of the courtroom and into the holding area, Anthony Civella understood the true cost of his father's throne. It wasn't about the money or the power. It was about the terrible, isolating burden of a crown that could only be worn in the dark. And he had been forced to wear it in the brightest light imaginable. The kingdom of silence had found its last, noisy king, and the sound of its fall was the gavel of a federal judge. The prison cell door closed with a sound that was both metallic and final. For Anthony Civella, the sentence, a term of years that felt like a life, was less a punishment than a ratification. The noisy, public world that had judged him was now locked out. In the sterile quiet of his cell, he was left alone with the very thing he had failed to uphold: silence. The appeals ran their course and were denied. The empire, what fragile remnants were left, dissolved. The loyal old-timers faded away into retirement or their own quiet ends. The young, hungry faces moved on to other gangs, other hustles, finding new thrones to chase. The Civella name, once spoken in whispers of fear and respect, was now a footnote in legal journals and true crime paperbacks. A cautionary tale about a son who couldn't carry the father's shadow. Rose Civella lived out her days in the family home, a fortress now filled with memories instead of power. She tended her garden, a quiet act of defiance against the concrete and noise that had swallowed her men. The government took most of what was left, but they could not take the deed to her house or the photos on her mantle. She passed away years later, the last keeper of a story too complex to ever tell. And Nicholas Civella? His grave remained, a simple stone in a Kansas City cemetery. But his true legacy was not in the ground. It was in the persistent power of the unanswered question. Law enforcement historians would cite his reign as a masterclass in evasion. Old crime buffs in Midwestern bars would still debate the extent of his reach, the brilliance of his low-profile strategy. He became a ghost not just of a city, but of an idea, the idea that the most effective power is the kind that is felt but never seen, that governs through expectation rather than command. Tony Civella, after serving his time, vanished into the witness protection program, a final, ironic twist. The man born to inherit a hidden kingdom chose, in the end, to disappear into a different kind of shadow, one provided by the state his father had outwitted. He became a true ghost, leaving no public trace, his story ending not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic sigh. In the end, the story of Nicholas Civella is the story of a vanishing act. He built a kingdom on silence, ruled from the wings, and left a stage that seemed, for a while, empty. But the lesson of his life echoes longer than any courtroom verdict or prison sentence. That in the brutal theater of power, the most unforgettable character is sometimes the one who never said a word, and the most durable throne is the one no one ever saw. The lights of Kansas City changed, the city moved on, but the echo of his quiet control lingers in the history of the American heartland. A whisper in the dark, proving that sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that are never fully told.